Jovan Buha! Buha!
Yo, I'm Jovan Buha, Lakers beat writer for The Athletic, and welcome to episode 25 of Buha's Block. On today's episode, we're going to be going through lessons for the Lakers from the conference finals. There are always things to learn from the teams that advance, and I think there are some valuable lessons that the Lakers can apply from the success of the Minnesota Timberwolves, Dallas Mavericks, Boston Celtics, and Indiana Pacers this season. There's always some form of adapting to the current trends of the league. So with all that said, let's get into what the Lakers can learn from these four teams. Before we get started, for those on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you can't tell, made a couple of studio upgrades. I have a neon light behind me, still playing around with what color I want to go with. Also put on a new pop filter for my microphone. And then for those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to hit that follow button. Thank you for the support. I really appreciate it. All right, so let's start with the Minnesota Timberwolves. And my lesson from the Wolves is that size still matters. And if you look at Minnesota and their primary playoff rotation, they only have one guy under 6'5". It's Mike Conley, though he has a 6'6.5" wingspan. So despite being listed at 6'1", he has the wingspan of a larger player. But putting him aside, you have Anthony Edwards and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, both 6'5". You have Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid, and Kyle Anderson, all 6'9". You have Karl Anthony Towns is 7 feet. Rudy Gobert is 7'2". So you have this giant rotation of 5 of their top 8 players are 6'9" and above. In some ways, it reminds me of the 2020 Lakers, who in the regular season had this supersized jumbo rotation where Rajon Rondo and Avery Bradley were the only players under 6'5" in the rotation. And then in the playoffs, that became only Rondo when Avery Bradley didn't join the team in the bubble. So some parallels there between the 2020 Lakers and these 2024 Timberwolves. And as Bomani Jones said on the TNT Western Conference Finals Altcast, there are also some similarities between this Timberwolves team and the Kobe Pau teams from 2008 to 2011, where you have Conley in that Fisher role, you have Edwards in the Kobe role, you have McDaniels in the Artest role as a 3-and-D wing, and then you have the monster frontcourt rotation of Gobert, Towns, and Reid, similar to Gasol, Bynum, and Odom. It's easy to see some similarities there between the general roster construction. Obviously, Kobe was at a different level than Ant. I would say Pau was at a different level than any of the Timberwolves bigs. So it's not an exact comparison, but I think like the player archetypes are relatively analogous. But comparisons to former Lakers teams aside, I think the message here is that size and length and athleticism still matter and will always matter. And Minnesota is a unique situation because they have 2 3-point shooting bigs in Karl Anthony Towns and Naz Reid. And those late 2000s Lakers teams had some similar things with Pau could stretch it to 16, 18, 20 feet, was not quite shooting threes at that time, though he could do it. It was like a late shot clock situation. And Lamar Odom was a low to mid 30s 3-point shooter, but he could still space the floor. And so 2 of the 3 bigs had some level of spacing and range. With Minnesota, it's at a different level where Towns is in the conversation for best 7-foot shooter of all time. It's really between him and Dirk statistically. And then you have Reid, who was one of the best 3-point shooters in the league this season and ended up winning 6-man. Has obviously been very impactful, but he can space the floor as well. So it helps to have size that can also space the floor. And then with some of the other guys in the rotation, obviously Rudy Gobert, Defensive Player of the Year, 4-time Defensive Player of the Year winner. Jaden McDaniels, all defense, second team, one of the best perimeter defenders and wing defenders in the league. Then you also have Kyle Anderson, who is one of the better bench rangy front court players in the league, and not a good shooter, but is a very skilled sort of point forward who can bring the ball up, move the ball at a high level, in addition to being a plus defender and being able to defend multiple positions. So you see, it's not just having the size, but it's having size that is skilled and can do multiple things. Even then, Towns and Naz Reid aren't necessarily plus defenders. Like this season, it was a lot more about them fitting in the team defense and having Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Kyle Anderson, like those guys doing a bulk of the work in terms of the pressuring and the switching and the rotating and, and funneling to Rudy Gobert. And Rudy Gobert carrying the bulk of the defense and the rim protection, the defense rebounding. And the lesson here for the Lakers is they have to find a way to upgrade the front court. I think they need a second center that is better than Jackson Hayes and Christian Wood. I think if they enter next season with one of those two as the primary backup center, that is a mistake. And those guys are just at a different level than a Minnesota front court. We saw that cost Denver, I think, in that series, not having a second center size player to spell Nikola Jokic and also potentially play next to him. There were several stretches in that series where Minnesota went giant with Naz Reid as the de facto small forward. And Denver it's rare to make Denver look small, but Minnesota is one of the few teams, if maybe the only team in the league that could do that. So I think the Lakers, as they look to upgrading the roster, whether it's via trade or whether it's in free agency using one of their exceptions, could be either the non-taxpayer or the taxpayer or a vet minimum contract, depending on how they structure the roster. I think they need to add another impactful big or two, and it's easier said than done. The number of bigs who can play in a playoff setting is still relatively low. Like size matters. Again, like looking at some of the bigs, it's either like a Miles Turner, who's a 3-and-D big, Kristaps Porzingis, who I know he's out, but also sort of a pick and pop big who's an elite rim protector on the other end. He could obviously post up and score from the mid range and stuff. Very skilled big. Al Horford has also basically become a 3-and-D big. Then Naz Reid, Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, Daniel Gafford, Derek Lively. Those guys are more of like that Clint Capella, DeAndre Jordan type rim running, offensive rebounds, just setting a bunch of screens, cutting and diving, and then defensively they're going to protect the rim, block shots, and sometimes be out on the perimeter, but for the most part their focus there is protecting the paint and protecting the defensive glass. So all those guys are at least average defensively for the most part. Again, Reed and Towns in the regular season weren't necessarily at that level, but having as much defensive firepower as they have around them, they can fit in within the team scheme, and they both deserve credit for the jobs that they did against the Nuggets in particular in the previous series. So I think the Lakers, it's a tall task. They need to upgrade the backup center spot and the wing position, and those are not the easiest positions to find in terms of size and skill. And a lot of the guys that have size and skill at those positions are making a lot of money. But as I look at the way that the Timberwolves were able to have success, not unlike some of the previous Laker teams that have won championships, I think the Lakers need to go back to that blueprint of how can we build a rotation where maybe there's one guy under 6'4", 6'5" in the rotation, but we need a giant rotation. And even if there are some defensive weak spots or slightly below average defenders in the rotation, how can we get it where the collective size and IQ and tenacity of our defense makes up for that and can hide some of those guys, and they just have to do simple tasks within the scheme. There are several lessons from each team really, but I think the biggest one for Minnesota is just how important and impactful their size and length and athleticism has been. Really the size and length, but several of those guys are very athletic as well. And I think the Lakers could learn a lot from that. And that should be one of the teams they're modeling themselves after as they build out this 2024-25 roster. Okay, next team is the Dallas Mavericks. And the lesson here is go for it, medium edition. So as I've talked about in previewing the offseason on several podcasts, several different episodes, the Lakers are looking at a couple of paths moving forward. One being making a small to medium-sized move to upgrade the rotation, be it trading one of their mid-sized salaries, D'Angelo Russell if he opts in, Rui Hachimura, Gabe Vincent, Jared Vanderbilt, etc., or making a larger move for a third star, be it a Donovan Mitchell, a Trae Young, a DeJounte Murray, etc. So those are the two most likely paths that the Lakers are going to take in terms of roster building. And the Dallas Mavericks are technically did both. They traded for another star in Kyrie Irving at the 2023 trade deadline, which we will touch on a little bit later in one of the lessons. But the one I'm going to look at more is the moves for Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington, two guys who have made a notable impact on the Dallas Mavericks season, two guys who became starters for the Mavericks, and two guys who have swung at moments, quarters and halves and games in their respective series against the Clippers and the Thunder to get to the Western Conference Finals. So let's break it down. Before the trade deadline, the Mavericks were 28-23, which was 8th in the West. At the deadline, they trade Richaun Holmes and a first-round pick to Washington for Daniel Gafford. They also trade Seth Curry, Grant Williams, and a first-round pick to Charlotte for PJ Washington and 2 seconds. So they trade, players aside, Seth Curry probably would not have been in their playoff rotation. Grant Williams was a risk that they took that did not end up working out. So they got out of that and had to pay to get off of his contract. But looking at it from a parallel perspective to the Lakers, they traded 2 first-round picks for 2 separate players and 2 starting level guys to rotation upgrades for them. So really, they flipped Richaun Holmes, Seth Curry, and Grant Williams, 2 guys who wouldn't have been in their playoff rotation, and 1 guy who was starting to look like a fringe rotation player in Williams, and 2 first-round picks for these 2 starting level guys. And from that point, they go 22-9, which is tied for the best record in the West with Denver and the second best record in the league post All-Star break. And they end up finishing 5th. They faced the LA Clippers in round 1. They beat the Clippers. Then they faced the Oklahoma City Thunder and they beat them. And I think a large part of that was these trades turned their season around. And it was a sign for going for it, despite at the time, looking at where Dallas was before the trade deadline. Of course, you have Luka, you have Kyrie. That's one of the best duos in the league. Luka's one of the best players in the league. You're factoring in his future and trying to go all in and make a win now move to keep him happy, to appease him, and to keep him in Dallas longer term. So you are looking at it from maybe a shorter term perspective of if we can't help facilitate him going on another deep playoff run, him winning a championship, maybe at some point in the next year, 2 years, whatever, he starts to look elsewhere and there will be plenty of suitors. I mean, really the whole league will be trying to acquire Luka if he was available. So Dallas decides to make a couple of, I think, medium upgrades using their draft capital. And look what happens. It turns their season around. They close the season playing as well as anybody in the West. And that has reflected in their playoff run. And now you see they make the conference finals. They win game 1. They have a legit shot to not only make the NBA finals, but I think win the NBA finals and beat Boston, who they will likely play. They went for it and it has paid off. And regardless of what happens in the conference finals, regardless of what happens in the finals, if they advance there, I would say this season is a success for the Dallas Mavericks. Different standards for the 2 franchises when looking at Dallas versus LA. LA is championship or bust each season. So if Dallas loses in the conference finals or finals, I think if that were the Lakers, they would still view the season as a failure. There are instances in which a franchise goes for it and it doesn't necessarily pan out the way that you were hoping or expecting it. But Dallas, to me, adding a rim running, rim protecting big in Daniel Gafford, who was there for the taking. Anybody could have had Daniel Gafford for a first round pick. And for whatever reason, there wasn't really much of a bidding war and the Mavericks ended up getting him. And he's been awesome. Imagining him on the Lakers next to Anthony Davis, potentially in certain lineups, or at least backing him up. That would have been very nice for the Lakers, right? PJ Washington coming in as this 3-and-D wing and showing that he could go from a chaotic environment, let's say, in Charlotte to playing high-level winning basketball in Dallas, buying into defending wing scorers and sometimes going long stretches without touching the ball and just being more of a 3-point, catch and shoot guy, but doing the dirty work, rebounding, defending, 50-50 balls, like all that stuff, PJ Washington has been able to do at a high level. And obviously in the Oklahoma City series, he was critical and had several monster games. They deserve credit for buying into their roles, but Dallas also deserves credit for identifying their potential and identifying their fit within the rotation. I think for the Lakers, this is a lesson that you don't have to necessarily go for the big swing. Depending on who the big swing is, it could make sense. I think if it's Donovan Mitchell, that is the one star right now that I think could elevate the Lakers to bona fide contender status. But Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, I'm not as sold on the likely price to get those guys, and giving up 2-3 picks, giving up potentially Austin Reeves, giving up some other assets. Like, I don't know if those guys make as much sense next to LeBron James and Anthony Davis. I think Donovan Mitchell does, but that might be the exception. Really, though, if you look at, again, potentially doing a smaller move and maybe you couple Rui Hachimura with the first-round pick. Maybe D'Lo opts in. You use D'Lo in a first-round pick. Maybe it's Gabe Vincent and a first-round pick, or it's Gabe Vincent and JHS. Like, if the Lakers end up going that route, I think the Dallas model is one where you already have a couple stars. Now let's put better fitting pieces around them, and a couple of guys who are going to do the dirty work, who have size, who have athleticism. Size and athleticism is a trend with a lot of these. I think Minnesota exemplifies it the best, just with how big their rotation is, how defensive-minded their rotation is. But Dallas has a lot of that as well, with Gafford and Lively and Washington, Derrick Jones Jr., Kyrie has really bought in defensively, Josh Green and Jaden Hardy. Like, they've got guys who are athletic and defensive-minded and impactful role players and energy guys. So that's definitely a subplot to all this, is just like role players. And I know LeBron and JJ Redick talked about it on the Mind the Game podcast, of all these role players being stars in their roles and really buying into specific roles. To me, the Lakers want to go the medium route, maybe, let's say, and use a couple picks to upgrade the roster, but maybe you keep a pick and you keep Austin Reeves and say, we're going to build around LeBron, AD, Austin Reeves, Vando, Max Christie, maybe a couple minimum guys. And then you go out and make a couple upgrades, and you bring in a better wing, you bring in a better backup, and you bring in another guard just to kind of replace D'Lo rotationally. And that team, it's more defensive minded, bigger, longer, more athletic. But there's ways to upgrade this roster without going for the third star. And I think Dallas is a good example of that. The next team here is the Boston Celtics, and the lesson is take more threes. Threes continue to be one of the more polarizing statistical categories in the NBA, where it has gone overboard at times. And we've seen like the Rockets infamously missing 27 straight 3-pointers, and some of these teams just taking too many. But there is a balance and there is a line, and the Lakers have too consistently been under that line. So let's look at Boston for a second. Like, Boston, of course, if the Lakers could have Drew Holiday and Derek White as their starting backcourt, two all defensive guys, an all-NBA first team guy in Jason Tatum, another all-star and all-NBA candidate in Jaylen Brown, and one of the best 3-and-D bigs in the league in Kristaps Porzingis. And that's a little reductive. Obviously can do a lot offensively, one of the better rim protectors in the league. So I'm not trying to diminish Porzingis, just trying to categorize. Like, the Celtics probably have the best starting five in the NBA. All five guys are pluses on both sides of the ball, which you rarely see a lineup, at least a starting lineup, with five guys being pluses on both sides. So Boston is coming at this from a surplus of talent and skill, positional size. There's a lot of size with that starting group. But Boston led the NBA in 3-point attempts in the regular season and the playoffs. They're also second in 3-point percentage in the playoffs, so they were hitting them at a high rate. Lakers, meanwhile, were 28th in attempts, but 8th in percentage, which was the best finish in the LeBron AD era. And as we saw in the second half of the regular season, LeBron had a career 3-point shooting year. D'Lo had a career 3-point shooting year. Austin Reeves had a good shooting season. Taurean Prince had a good shooting season. So the Lakers had as good of shooters as they've ever had, and that was reflected in the three-point percentage. It was not reflected in the three-point attempts. It was actually the lowest they've finished in terms of attempts. So the volume was not where it should have been in comparison with previous seasons. And for what it's worth, 3 of the top 4 teams in terms of playoff three-point attempts per game are in the conference finals. Boston, Indiana, and Dallas. And that has been a trend that has bore out over the course of this postseason, where I just went through and did this manually because I couldn't find the exact numbers online. But just looking at three-point attempts, not looking at makes, not looking at percentage, but looking at three-point attempts and just looking at team A versus team B, who shot more threes and what was the outcome of that game. Teams that attempted more threes than their opponents went 44 and 24 and 2. So there's 2 games in which the opponents tied. But that is a 63% win percentage, which just shows you the value of just taking more threes. Not about making. Like, there were several games in there where the opponent made more threes or shot a better three-point percentage, and it didn't matter because the team that was generating more threes was winning the game more often than not. And Boston is an extreme example because it was basically like any game Boston attempted more threes, they won. And the couple games they lost, they didn't attempt as many. But the trend is there. And looking at Lakers Nuggets and applying this to the Lakers, Denver shot more threes than the Lakers in all 5 games, and they won the series in 5. And obviously they went 4-1 in terms of the results of the team that shot more threes in the series. The lesson here is part of it is going to be personnel in terms of how you build your roster and getting better three-point shooters. But finishing 8th in percentage is pretty good. Being a top 10 three-point shooting team is a marker of offensive success. And obviously the Lakers were one of the best offenses in the league over the final few months of the season. But the key for me is they need a coach who is going to emphasize taking more threes, and they need the players to buy into that. And there is a limitation to, I think, them just trying to live at the rim and draw fouls. Because as we've seen in certain playoff matchups, there have been games where you're not getting calls and you're living at the rim and the refs are swallowing their whistles, and it's a war out there. And Denver's a low three-point shooting team as well. They were actually one of the 2 teams that attempted fewer threes than the Lakers this season in the regular season. But the fact that they were able to outshoot the Lakers, or out attempt the Lakers in that series in all 5 games, I think that the Lakers need to reevaluate their offensive approach. I know LeBron has talked about it on his podcast with JJ Redick about the value of threes and how you need to be shooting more threes in the modern game. Now, I don't know if that's just podcast speak or if that's something that he truly believes, but either way, I think whether it's JJ or someone else, the Lakers need to bring in a coach who is going to emphasize the three-point shot at a higher level. I'm not saying they need to be the 2018 Rockets. I'm not saying they need to be the 2016 Warriors or the Cavs of that era or the Celtics, right? Like, I don't think they need to be shooting 45, 50 threes each game, but it needs to be higher than 28 to 32 threes, which is the range they were in more often than not. So I think a coach who's going to bump the Lakers into that like 35 to 38, 35 to 40 range a little bit more consistently would do a lot of good for their offense and being able to scale it to a playoff setting and just having it be a bit more sustainable. And again, there is a line with this because you don't want to overdo it. I think Boston is an example where they will pass up open layups for driving kick threes. To me, it just comes down to striking a better balance for the Lakers. They've been so archaic in the Frank Vogel and Darvin Ham eras in terms of their three-point volume that they need a coach who's going to encourage a more modern approach. The final team is the Indiana Pacers, and the lesson here is go for it, star edition. So this is the other path that the Lakers could take in terms of going for a 3rd star. But let's take a look back at Indiana. On paper, they don't profile as a contender, right? You typically need a top 10 guy, which if you look at the other 3 conference finalists, they all have one top 10 player. Jason Tatum's a top 10 player. Anthony Edwards is a top 10 player. Luka Doncic is a top 10 player. those guys are all arguably top 5 players. I think Tatum is on the outside looking in that conversation. Luka is comfortably in the top 5 for me. He's probably number 2 behind Nikola Jokic right now. Anthony Edwards is a borderline top 5 guy. You can make a case for him, I think, as high as like number 4 or number 5. And then Jason Tatum is probably more in like that 7 to 10 range, but still a top 10 guy. Indiana does not have a top 10 guy. Tyrese Haliburton, to me, I know he made All-NBA third team, but I would probably have him more in like that 16 to 20 range if I was ranking guys. Like several guys, Joel Embiid comes to mind as a guy who didn't make an All-NBA team, who I would comfortably have ahead of Tyrese Haliburton. So you maybe have like a top 20 guy, but you don't have more than one top 30 guy. And that's the other thing here is a lot of these teams, like Kyrie is a top 30 guy. Jaylen Brown is a top 30 guy. Depending on how you feel about Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns, those are potentially, at least one of them is a top 30 guy, maybe top 35, top 40, but like they're in that conversation. They're in that mix. Pacers, like Pascal Siakam has been really good for them. I would not categorize him as a top 30 guy. Maybe probably similar mix to Towns and Gobert in like top 40, top 35 maybe. But I mean, you look at the top 30, like the league's loaded right now. Like being a top 30 player is pretty difficult with the amount of talent right now in the NBA. But the Pacers still go for it. They trade 3 first-round picks for Pascal Siakam, despite being at the time looking like a play-in team. They say, hey, we're going to invest. Like we're not a destination. We don't attract stars. So let's trade 3 first-round picks. Like we have something going here with this elite offense. Tyrese Haliburton is breaking out as a potential superstar. Obviously getting a lot of buzz around the in-season tournament. They make the in-season tournament finals where they get stomped by the Lakers. But still, they beat the Bucks and the Celtics along the way. And they're looking at it like, we just want to be competitive and we want to put together, like, we feel like the East is there for the taking and we just want to be as competitive as possible, right? So they go for it. They finish the season 24-18 after that, earning them the 6th seed. And there's a luck element for sure of they play the Bucks without Giannis and Dame eventually goes out. They play the Knicks without like half of their starters, and then Jalen Brunson eventually gets injured in Game 7. Like there were several things that went in the Indiana Pacers' favor, but they were only in position to capitalize on that because of the Pascal Siakam trade and him coming in and making an immediate impact and offsetting Tyrese Haliburton's injury and the slump that he went through over the course of the second half of the season as he came back and rushed things to try and make an All-NBA team. So the basketball gods rewarded the Indiana Pacers for going for it by giving them a relatively easy path in terms of the Bucks, who I think most people would pick the Bucks over the Pacers if both teams were healthy, and against the Knicks, who I also think most people would pick the Knicks over the Pacers if both teams were healthy, but they weren't healthy, and you can only play the team that's in front of you, and they took advantage of it. They beat the Bucks in 6. They beat the Pacers in 7. Now they're in the conference finals, and they had a chance in Game 1 to beat the Celtics. They ended up blowing it. We'll see what happens in Game 2. But the Pacers, like if they had won Game 1, we're having a different conversation right now where we're like, did the Pascal Siakam trade like make this a potential finals team? And they could still potentially make the finals. I think losing Game 1 was tough, and it's going to be tough to win 5 games in the series essentially. But that aside, I think Indiana showed that when you have an opportunity to go for an all-star level talent, even if it's not the best player available, even if it's not a top 10, top 15 guy, if you can add a guy who makes your team better and who fits your style of play, fits your roster, then you should go do it. And Indiana is an example of that. So I think Dallas and Indiana are the 2 models for me in terms of the upside of improving the roster with your draft capital. And Dallas, it was small to medium-sized moves with Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington. With Indiana, it was a bigger swing with Pascal Siakam, but it was someone who fit their style of play offensively, gave them a go-to scorer in the half court who could attack off the dribble, get to the rim, also fit in with their defensive schemes. So you got to be selective. It's not just about trading for Joe Schmo just because Joe Schmo is top 30, top 35 guy, but more often than not, those guys can improve your roster. And really, if you look at all 4 of these teams, they've all taken big swings within the last couple of years. So for Dallas, it was Kyrie at the 2023 trade deadline. For Minnesota, it was Gobert in the summer of 2022. For Boston, it was the Holiday and Porzingis trades in the 2023 offseason. And for Indiana, it was Siakam back in January. So all four of these teams have made trades for all-stars, all-star level guys, high-level starters in the past couple years that reshaped their team. There were all relative risks, like thinking about Kyrie and how toxic he was viewed at the time, of all the uncertainty with him off the court. And is he going to be reliable? Is he going to show up? Can you depend on him? He's answered all those questions. Gobert, like a lot of people flame the trade. I flame the trade, and it has clearly worked out based on the results this season. Holiday and Porzingis, the Celtics had to trade Marcus Smart, who was a fan favorite, a beloved member of that core. But they invested that draft capital and they brought back two high-level starters, and it created one of the best teams statistically of all time. And we'll see if they can actualize that potential and win a championship, potentially in a dominant fashion. And then, of course, Indiana with Siakam. So I think the message here, looking at all four teams to some extent, size, athleticism, length, all really matter, particularly in the case of Minnesota. Go for it, whether it's a medium-sized move, upgrading a couple starters, or a bigger move going for a third star. Dallas and Indiana exemplify the go for it attitude. And then you have Boston, who also went for it and exemplifies that attitude to an extent, but also is playing the game from a math perspective with their three-point attempts and with their style of offense that really plays to their advantage and gives them a built-in buffer in a lot of games. So those are some lessons for the Lakers to take from these conference finalists and apply moving forward as they build out their roster during the 2024 offseason. That will do it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching on YouTube and listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and your podcast platform of choice. For those on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment and like this video if you enjoyed it. And for those on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your podcast platform of choice, be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. I'll be back next week with episode 26 of Buha's Block. I will talk to you then.